Hi, are we live? Are we live? Yes, I think we are. Good. Is it still morning? No. Good afternoon, you gorgeous humans. It's Rachel Davis here, founder of Lala Tigers. I am coming live today with the beautiful Una Archer, who I will introduce for you in a little while. And I'm really interested in having this conversation today because what's brought this conversation about is that I did a post just a few days ago. And in it, I had a little bit of a rant, if I'm honest, about the proposed changes for funding to bring in many more hours for children as young as 9 months. So we're talking an increase of free childcare for up to 30 hours for children as young as 9 months. And it kind of made me a bit cross. I did a bit of a post about it and it brought in a huge amount of comments. Now, I just want to kind of say off the bat that this is not a political conversation that we're having. Neither Una nor myself kind of feel that we are qualified or want to kind of wade into the whole political side of it. However, what I felt was really interesting and something I did want to explore further, particularly from the comments that came in, was that there were so many different opinions and not a lot of understanding around what happens for the children, you know, what happens in terms of attachment, how does it affect relationship and connection. And I know that parents are, this is like an age-old question that mums in particular and fathers, everybody struggles with a little bit. It's the old, do I go back to work? When do I go back to work? What is the right time? Where is the right place? And these are big questions. So I thought I would invite Una Archer, who is Teen Tiger's resident psychologist, on today, so that we can have a little bit of a natter about it, because I thought it would be interesting. I thought our audience could learn something. And as always, we would always really love to hear your comments. So if you're watching it live, then you can make a little comment and we can see what's coming up. If you're registered with StreamYard, even better, because I can see your name. Or if you're watching this back on a replay, if you give me a hashtag replay, we would love to hear your comments. So before we go any further, I would love to introduce Una. So there's a lot of you on my page that have seen Una before when we've done some of my free events, when we've done trainings. Una Archer supports parents in my Fear to Fierce experience. She's part of Team Tiger. She's our resident psychologist. And she's a total badass human. So let me explain a little. Shall I introduce some of your things, Una? Because it's horrible.
Please do, yeah.
All of these things. So first of all, Una is a mum, which I think we really need to start with. Una is a single parent of 2 glorious girls. She also has been through my own program herself with her children when I first launched it a few years ago as a beta program. Una is a psychologist. She is a brain spotting facilitator, a circle of security specialist. She's also trained as a yoga teacher. She trained as a kindergarten teacher for Steiner Waldorf, didn't you?
Yeah.
As well. But more than anything, and I'm sure there's some other things which you can fill in the gaps for me, Una, if I've missed anything.
No, you did a great job, Rachel.
Thank you very much. But she's also emotional security geek. Now, I actually met Una a few years ago, and just through it was a business container, wasn't it? And we actually realised through talking and through working alongside each other that we had a very similar ethos in terms of early attachment, early connection. And after going through my process, I invited Una to come on and work in Team Tiger because she has this wealth of experience, a wealth of knowledge. I'm a personal growth geek. And if I talk about me being a personal growth geek, Una is emotional security geek. And she can wax lyrical about the emotional security of children and attachment. And she helps parents dig underneath what is going on in children's behaviour to look at perhaps the emotional reasons for things or what might be going on for the child. So let's dig in, Una. Is there anything that I've missed? Oh, yes, there was something else, wasn't there? Because also Una has also had experience being an early childcare provider herself, right? And has also supported and still, I believe, supports some nurseries and helps nurseries support children in those situations as well. So why don't you tell us, Una, before we get into the questions that we've prepared, why don't you tell me a little bit about your experience in your own experience in childcare and what you do with nurseries as well, and then we can move on to digging into the juicy bit.
Yeah, so when my children were young, I was childminding for 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
Just, because I couldn't think, the idea of going back to work, it just didn't sit with me right at all. So I was childminding for 5 years. Initially, I was childminding on my own, and kind of was part of the childminding network. And I was also a support childminder for my local authority, and it meant that I had the privilege to go into different settings and talk to different childminders. And then a few years later, I set up a childminding setting with a friend of mine, so we ran a bigger setting together. And I also did consultancy in wide range of nurseries, sort of, kind of, I don't know what's the right word, just sort of straightforward EYFS nurseries, Steiner, Montessori, Reggio Emilia. And it was really interesting because that experience came first. And through seeing different settings, different providers, children in those different settings, what I noticed was that invariably, in pretty much each setting, you would get a mix of children that some of them are thriving, they're just getting on, engaging with activities that are provided for them that day. They reach out to the carers who are there, they connect, they get on well with their peers, and they're just sort of quite easy to look after. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you have these children, you kind of, feel like they come in kind of a pile of pieces, you pick them up, and before you know it, they kind of fall apart again. And of course, it's like, any variation in between. And the more I observed that, the more I had the sense that, there had to be some sort of underlying needs that just have to be met for children to thrive. And it doesn't, if you are Steiner setting, a Montessori setting, a Reggio Emilia, whatever philosophy you follow, there has to be some foundations that we have to meet for children to thrive. And I've been sitting with this question for a number of years before I revisited attachment theory.
Mm-hmm.
And then I just, had this whole body reaction where you just kind of know that's it. That was the missing piece that I've been looking for all along.
Hence your lifelong passion for attachment, right? And emotional security. So I had a bit of a reaction, obviously, I had a bit of a rant. So let's go straight in with what happens, because I know that parents are sitting at home, and I, for one, if I'd have known these things, this is why I wanted to do this live today with you, Una, is that for my situation, my first child went into like a full 9 till 5 situation 3 days a week at 11 months old. And it killed me. It destroyed me. My employer was horrific. They were actively trying to discourage me from going back to work. They sent me on a 3-week residential training course. So not only did I have to put my child into childcare, but I then had to be away. They wouldn't let me do the travel. I had to stay in the hotel. So it felt very much like they were trying to stop me coming back to work, but I desperately needed to go back to work. I think if I'd have known then what I know now, I would not have done that. And I know that certainly I got pregnant fairly quickly with my second child. And when I did that, I was like, I'm not doing that again, because it also traumatized me. I felt traumatized from the whole experience. And that's when I set up my music session so that I could take my children with me. And I ran Tiny Tempo for 6 years because I was like, I'm not going back into that corporate environment. So I imagine there must be a lot of other parents that have younger children, and we're talking preschool. So what happens? What I'm interested in is what is happening for the child when they're separated from their parents, and what's happening for the parent when it's there's two edges of that same sword, isn't there? It creates a stress response. Can you talk to us a little bit about when they're disconnected from their primary source of attachment?
Yes. And first of all, Rachel, I'm so sorry that was your experience. That sounds awful to go through that when your baby is so young.
Mm.
Yeah. So, and to answer to your question, there's a few things I want to mention. I think if we look historically at how we raise our children, it's actually quite recent that we as parents raise our children in that little bubble and we're so responsible for them. And I think when you go from that to where you hand your children over to somebody, maybe like partly that's why it's such a big transition. If you think about how, and of course, like different cultures, different times are different, different. But if you think about if you raise your child in that proverbial village where you have grannies, aunties, neighbors, nephews happy to scoop up the baby and be there for them, and this whole support network, like from the beginning, like that transition is so different, isn't it? Because you build that relationship, you build that trust with other people, and it just feels natural.
Yeah. But our fragmented society, we don't seem to have that so much anyway, right? So automatically you've got the financial pressure on the parent where they're needing to go back to work to financially support themselves. But then they're like, okay, and not everybody has these close connections, which I agree with you is completely ideal, but not always possible. So like all of these fears that go through, and I really want to be really clear that I'm not trying to, I don't want to guilt any parents. I don't want to shame any parents. I just want to have open discussions and start dialogues, because I feel like that is how change happens. That's how awareness happens. So what happens then for a child? Because my understanding from my reading, I'm fascinated with trauma. I read about it. I'm not a trauma specialist. I'm not a trauma person. I'm a personal growth geek. But because of my personal experiences from trauma and from my personal experiences, I've always been fascinated, because I do believe that that's where a lot of people who get interested in growth, they start. So, and I was learning about how actually sometimes it's the earlier that instances happen, or you get disconnected from your relationships or your family network, the more traumatic it can be. So what happens for a child when they're going in? Because these early parts, this is where a child's early networks of their co-regulatory, their core regulation of their stress response is being built in these first few months, certainly within the first 9 months, which is when they're proposing to send children in. So what happens then? So it's a very long way of me asking the same question, Una. What happens for a child when they are disconnected from their caregivers?
Yes. So, of course, every situation is different. But I think when we think about it, we really need to look at a few more elements that are at play in that situation.
Okay.
And so we know from attachment research that children form attachment hierarchies.
Okay.
So if your children spend most of the time with you, if you were available, consistent caregiver for them, you will be number one on that attachment hierarchy, and they will trust you. They will come to you when they need soothing, and so you establish that secure relationship. And on that hierarchy, children can have definitely up to 7, maybe more. But so thinking about what we covered already, maybe we don't have that many people around who would be those willing, secure hands for our children. So children can have up to 7 people on their attachment ladder. So when we talk about what happens when child is being separated from their primary caregiver, we really need to sort of think about and look who's in their attachment ladder. If they're going to person number 2, it's fine. Generally speaking, of course, every situation is unique. And when we think about children's emotional security, we know that feeling that connection with their secure base, their attachment figure, is their most important emotional need. Yeah. They need to feel that all the time. And it doesn't have to be the parent all the time. So when we think about sending our children to childcare, the way I think about it is, a bit like how penguins sort of in the Antarctic, they hold that precious egg and then they pass it to another parent when that parent needs to go back to the ocean and catch some fish. So they not just go into the vacuum or a room without people. Really, if we can think about it, so my child is going to another pair of secure hands, and if that relationship is established, then it can be a beautiful, enriching experience. I feel like I've talked for a bit. I'll pause.
No, it's interesting. But I think it's also really interesting to acknowledge that it has to be that safe pair of hands. And I think sometimes when you're putting children into childcare or you're passing your children over, you've gone and you've met the person, and there's normally one person that's going to be looking specifically after your child or looking after normally three children, right? But it's kind of like it's a scary thing. And I suppose you don't really know the values of this person. They're not necessarily going to be the same as yours. You don't know the background of this person. You don't know how well they're going to be responding to your child's needs, how attentive they're going to be. You have no idea of the other children that person is going to be caring for or what their needs are. So there's a lot of variables at play. And I think also there's a lot of variables when you think about how some children would handle it better, because we're not all built the same. Some traumatic pregnancies, or some children might be very well secured before they go in, or some children might have had a traumatic birth, or there's all kinds of things, and just the general sensitivity of a child. Some children can be incredibly resilient, and so what could be considered traumatic, for want of and I don't mean to sound dramatic in that, but could be traumatic or activate a stress response for one child is not necessarily going to be activating a stress response for another. So I appreciate there's huge amounts of variables in there. But let me ask you another question, because I wanted to move on. Excuse me, Una. I wanted to talk about a little bit about what good childcare looks like. So you've talked a little bit about passing the egg, and I love that analogy. I think it's brilliant. Like that's beautiful. What can parents be looking for in a really great connected setting? What does good childcare look like? Because that's what it is that we're looking for, right?
So that's a big question.
Sorry. Touch on it.
Maybe what could be helpful if you bring up the circle of security graphic. That could be a starting point. I was trying to answer that question.
Sure.
So if you can see a little bit of background where the circle is coming from, it was created by the Circle of Security Parenting team based in the US, and they looked at 50 years of attachment research and kind of looked at the studies, took away all the jargon, and created this graphic that summarizes what is it that children need from their caregiver to thrive, to have that secure attachment that is foundation for healthy development in all areas. And I appreciate that you said about different temperaments, different neurodiversities. Everybody needs that foundation, especially if there are some, additional challenges that the child, the family are dealing with. So on that graphic, we have on the left side, secure base. I don't know if it's the left side on your screen, but secure and safe haven. And that is that attachment figure. So when your child is with you, you are the secure base and safe haven for your child. And then once the child knows who's my secure base, they begin to move in circles. They go out to explore. And when we look at, I think, different nurseries and childcare settings, we see a lot of talk about how we support that exploration, learning, growth, development. But then the bottom of the circle, so the child explores when their cup is full, and then they reach that turning point on the other side. On my screen is the right side, where then they had enough. They might be tired, overwhelmed. They don't want to play anymore. What they need is to come back and reconnect, to rest, to be comforted, to make sense of what their experience, or to fill their cup, in other words. And it's a huge commitment to be those hands for the child. So for me, a good childcare setting is, if I was a parent, I would look for a person who I feel are committed being that secure base and safe haven for my child, that I feel like I can trust them to be that consistently, that they're available, that they're understanding, that I understand that it's important to them.
I find it's interesting as you're looking at that, and I'm thinking this is for parents as well. So the two things that came up for me while you were talking, Una, was the first thing was that how it's always interesting. I used to remember when my children then did go into sort of, from 3 years old, and they start to get their 3 hours and they started to go in. When I noticed this when I came back from my 3 weeks this trip of having to go away as well. When I came back, initially my children would lose the plot when they saw me. And this can be really, really common because you're the safe space. It's interesting to see how children, we are so hardwired for connection. We are so hardwired for acceptance, how children will mask and will kind of stuff down emotions that they have because they don't feel safe to express them. And I know we've all of us have felt situations like that where we have to be a certain thing. For example, I wouldn't want to cry on a live with you or whatever. I would hold that in and then perhaps go and do it in private. And it's that kind of thing when I would pick my children up, they would burst into tears. And this didn't make any sense to me in the beginning. But of course, the more I understood about this, the more this makes complete sense. So that was the first thing that came up for me. And the second thing I was really interested in is like how actually we go off and play, but then sooner or later we become overwhelmed and we have to process and we have to fill up our own cup. And I thought how relevant that was for the parents as well. I know that's something that we talk a lot about in my supported containers is actually the mental and emotional and physical well-being of the parent, to be able to be the secure base in the first place, create that environment where you're able to be that consistent safe place. So those were the things that were coming up, but I think it's really interesting to see it on a diagram like this, and for people to see that when your children are coming to you, they've had enough. And it's just how can you help support them? And I think when it comes down to childcare, it's going to come down to a gut feeling. But I suppose I don't want to get too much into childcare because I really want to talk about attachment, because for me, that's the vibe for today's live. It's about a gut feeling, and it's about where is the quality of the relationships. Is there anything that you wanted to talk about on this again, Una, or can I remove this now?
Yeah, I think you can. Thank you, Rachel.
Because I wanted to share with you, and I was talking to you a little bit about this. I was listening this morning and I thought this was really relevant, and I thought I would bring it up as well before we move on to the last question. Is that I was reading, so I listened to lots of audiobooks, and this was a book by Oprah Winfrey, and it was called What's Happened to You, and it was about trying to change the narrative with people as like, it's not what's wrong with you, it's about what's happened to you and understanding the effects on their nervous systems and dysregulation throughout their lives. And it was a book by, she was working in conjunction with a guy called Dr. Bruce Perry. And he was talking about a study which was taken with 27,000 different children. And this was following on from anybody who's familiar with the ACE score or ACE awareness. ACE awareness is a study where they looked at 10 different difficult scenarios. Could be the death of a loved one, it could be separation, it could be divorce, it could be abuse, it could be something like that. And the higher the score, for example, every child would score 1 point for every experience that they had experienced. And the higher the score, the higher the ACE score. Am I making sense? I feel like I'm waffling, Una, sorry. And so it looked at the ACE awareness, but it went far deeper. And what it really looked at was actually the quality of relationship or the depth of relationship. And anybody who is a fan of Dr. Gabor Mate or anybody like that who looks at secure attachment. It's often that children can actually deal with stressful situations, providing that quality of attachment and quality of connection is there. And this survey, if you like, was looking at the nature, the quantity and the quality of the connection. And what it found, which I found fascinating, was that the history of relationship or the connection was far more influential. So that quality of that early connection has far more influence and a much deeper impact than any history of adversity of trauma. And I think this is a beacon of light and hope for any children that perhaps any families here who perhaps have adopted children or have children been through difficult experiences, whether that be accidents or loss or grief or things that are outside of our control, right through to things like abuse or even just having accidents or stressful situations, that it's that connection that has a much, much deeper impact. So that was the first thing that I wanted to mention. But also this study went on to say that it was actually also the earliness, the exposure of any kind of traumatic experience, the earlier that was, the more impact that would have. So, for example, if a child experienced a stressful event at 2, but then had really deep, nurturing relationships for the rest of its life, the impact of the earlier event would have more effect than if that effect happened at 7 or 8. So there's 2 things at play here. One is the quality of the attachments and the relationships around the child, which has a real impact, but also the age that a child experiences those things. Have you got any thoughts on that, Una, at all? I know I've just given you a lot of information, but have you wanted to add to that?
I love that because, I think those big events, say like losing a family member or separation, they can be, we can see them. We know that it happens. It's just kind of, they're in your face. But when it comes to our relationships, because they're always there, they're a bit like air. They're so vital, but we don't even notice them.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to generalize, but a lot of how we do relationships is a bit like how we drive or how we ride a bike. We just kind of do it without giving it much thought. And
really,
I'm not
and quite often handed down from our parents, right? Subconscious programming, which is my bag as a hypnotherapist and an NLP practitioner. Sorry, I'm interrupting, but it is, isn't it? Most of us are parenting in the way that we were parented. We all go around and can hear our mother's voice as we're saying things, right? It happens. It really does.
Yes, and also a lot of parenting advice out there is kind of behavior based. How do I get my child how do I get them to do something? How do I stop them to do something? Anyway, I'm muddling it up. And so I think it's so helpful to have that type of research. It really highlights, it's those 100 little opportunities that you get to connect with your child a day. I do notice them. Are you present for them? That what makes, the real difference, the real kind of protective bubble around them.
It really, really does. And it's one of the things that I say all of the time is that, like, there's I can't remember which film it's from, but it's like there's this film where it's Al Pacino, and it's like it's a sports team, and it's like the inches are everywhere. Like, you go out there and you fight for the inches. And I kind of feel like it's like that in our parenting, because I feel sometimes we are so stressed, we're so dealing with all of these outside influences, and sometimes parenting can become a secondary thing. And it's like you say, that it's the quality of the presence, and that the inches are in fact all around us in every single. And I always say the thing that is causing you the most stress with your child is the biggest opportunity that you have for growth and connection. If you can reframe how you're seeing it and how you're approaching it, those are the biggest opportunities that you have, and they're everywhere. But we do have to be tuned in. We do have to be present. And let's face it, that sometimes our own stresses, mental health, anxieties, pressures can also affect our ability to be present, which is why parent mental health so vastly affects this attachment process, right? Our ability to be present. And it's actually why Transform Your Parenting, which is a program that I run, we look at exactly that. We look at creating positive interactions, turning stressful stuff into fun. How can we show up in a way that is going to make our child feel valued, respected? But I also want to dig in into what you said. There's so much of this, like, fixing behavior. It almost feels like underneath behavior, I mean, I talk about this myself, is that a thought drives a feeling and a feeling drives a behavior. And that's what's happening for our children. Underneath behavior, there's something else going on, right? What's underneath that behavior? Can you talk to us a little bit about what's happening under children's behavior, what could be happening for them, and how that could be showing up in behavior?
So I love thinking of behavior as a fire alarm.
It's communication, isn't it? All of it.
Yeah. So it does try to convey a message to us about emotional need, and it can come from that discomfort that the children, they can't quite put it into words, and kind of comes out sideways in that difficult behavior. And so
I always think that your child is not being difficult, your child is having a difficult time. And when you can just sort of reframe that, you approach things in a completely different way, don't you?
Yes, and there's another sort of idea, I feel that it's not spoken enough, sort of generally in kind of parenting conversations, is that when the child is having a difficult time or dealing with difficult emotions, there's a lot of talk about how to help them manage, regulate, what tools they can have. But really, they regulate, coming back to the diagram, they co-regulate. Like, we need to be available to help them regulate.
Completely.
And I wonder if maybe it's oversimplifying, but we can say that difficult behavior is their way of asking us to be more present with them.
That's beautiful. I think you're right. It's our ability to be able to regulate ourselves and hold that space for the child to safely have and express their emotions and still feel connected, and be the buffer and that safe place that you talk about, which can be very challenging for ourselves when we have all of the other things going on and our needs perhaps not being met. And it's that, isn't it? As you say, they learn to co-regulate way before they regulate themselves. And it's that ability to, like you say, just being there. And you know this yourself, and I always think it's really nice to relate this. It's easier to relate when you think about yourself. When you are upset and you go to somebody, basically what you want in that moment is you don't want somebody to fix or solve your problem. What you want is someone to put your arms around you and help you get through that emotion, and just to kind of, until you can regulate yourself. And then you can problem solve till the day is long, right? As women, we love to do this, right? We will sit and problematize and we will put the world to rights. But in that moment, when someone's trying to fix you, it's not what you need. And I think we can apply that to our children, to be able to hold that space. That is what's required. It's just being in a safe, loving way, which brings me back to, I suppose, the foundation song for all of my work, which is love is the answer to every single question. And I feel like that's probably a very nice place to end, Una, in that connection really is the foundation for everything, for a child's self-esteem, for the sense of self, for the sense of self-confidence, for giving them the confidence to go out and venture away and become independent. They have to go through dependence before getting to dependent, right? So, Una, is there anything you'd like to add? No.
Beautifully said, Rachel. And attachment research supports that.
Anybody wants to go, please go and look at Sir John Bowlby's Theory of Attachment. Please go and read anything by Dr. Gabriel Maté. There's a really good book that you recommended, actually, which I'm just starting, which is also a very good book. So I'm digging into this at the moment as well. And of course, if anybody is interested in digging into this further, please do reach out. I myself run a number of connected parenting programs. Una supports parents within that. Una also does one-to-one work. I'm sure you can reach out to Una. We will drop Una's links down below so that you can go and find her separately as well. Thank you, Una, for your time. It's always a pleasure. We didn't dance today. We normally had a little bit of banging house at the beginning, but yeah, there was too much for us to talk about today. I really appreciate your time and your expertise. And if you have any questions, please drop them down below. If you're watching it back on a replay, as I said, drop down any questions or comments that you have below. We would love to hear any thoughts that come up from you from today's session. So thank you. Have an awesome day, Una. Go and stay fierce. And rah, babe. Love it.